In the last video, we talked a little bit about the concept of an ecological niche, and we discussed the notion of ecosystem engineers with beavers, how they can alter a landscape, they can cut down trees and convert, say, a forest ecosystem into a wetland ecosystem by damming up a stream or a creek. So this brings us to the idea that the impact of one particular species in an ecosystem might be larger than the impact of another species in an ecosystem. All of the species participate in the ecosystem. They all have different jobs, right? They're all doing stuff, but some jobs might have a greater impact, a greater effect on the nature of that ecosystem than others do. So the beavers are one such species. They represent a very small portion of the overall ecosystem diversity, of the overall species diversity of that ecosystem. If we were to weigh up the total mass of the beavers, right, just take all of the beavers and weigh up how much the total mass of beaver is in this entire ecosystem and compare it to the total mass of all other organisms in this ecosystem, they represent a very small amount of all of the biological living material in this ecosystem, but their impact is huge compared to that very tiny percentage that they represent. And the reason why I'm saying compare them by mass is you need some sort of fair comparison, because if you're comparing, say, the impact of honeybees to the impact of a grizzly bear, and you use population, obviously it doesn't seem totally fair to compare the impact of tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of bees to one grizzly bear. But if you compare them based on their total biomass, it makes a little bit more even of a comparison. Some species are just more abundant than others in terms of sheer numbers. So this brings us to the idea of a keystone species. A keystone species is one whose impact on the community is much larger than its total mass or abundance would indicate. An example of this would be the pollination services offered by bees and butterflies. Bees and butterflies represent a very small amount of the total biomass of the ecosystem, but their impact in terms of the biodiversity of that ecosystem is huge because they support the reproduction and the maintenance of all of these plant species, right? Without their work, none of these plants are going to be reproducing each year. So they make sure that the populations of all of these different plant species are maintained year to year to year. There might be dozens and dozens and dozens of different flowering species that only exist because of the work of these honeybees and butterflies. So because this one species exists, dozens of other species are maintained, making them a keystone species. They are paramount to keeping the species diversity of this ecosystem rich. Another example might be a predator that keeps the populations of the species it preys on in check. And last time I used the example of a carnivore keeping herbivores in check, and then that makes sure that there's not so many herbivores that they completely eat all of the plant life, which would then cause population crashes and devastate the ecosystem. Up here in this photo, I have a picture of a starfish. And it turns out that starfish are keystone species in many of the ecosystems that they occur in. Starfish are an animal and they prey on mussels. So they sort of move around slowly in the intertidal zones and they find these mussels and they eat them. They did experiments in the 1960s to see what would happen if they just removed the starfish from intertidal zones on the Washington coast. And what happened was the mussels that they prey on, their populations increased. And that makes sense, right? The mussels didn't have a predator, so there was nothing killing them. Their reproduction rates stayed the same, but their death rate went down, so their numbers increased and increased and increased. And they spread until they covered everything. They covered every little square inch of rock. Anywhere where the mussels could get a foothold, they spread out. And they started dominating all of the resources of that area, so much so that almost no other species in that location could get any kind of foothold. They couldn't establish themselves on any of the rocks. No other species of mussels or bivalves or any of these other organisms, different competitors couldn't compete with all of these mussels coming through and establishing themselves and using up all of the nutrients and resources and rock space. So they spread until they covered absolutely everything. It turns out that the starfish were acting as a keystone species. By keeping the number of mussels in check, it allowed other species to be able to compete, to be able to establish themselves, and this increased the overall biodiversity. Adding this one predator increased the number of total species that existed in this intertidal zone. So the starfish, even though they didn't represent a huge amount of the biodiversity themselves, they had the effect of increasing the total biodiversity of that ecosystem. I have this note here at the bottom that says, may cause population crashes and extinctions of any dependent species if drawn to extinction itself. Well, imagine if the starfish population, imagine some disease comes through that starts wiping out starfish. Well, same thing would happen as when the experimenters removed the starfish from the intertidal zones. Those mussels would start going wild. All of the species that are their competitors would start to die off, and you wouldn't just lose the starfish, you would lose lots and lots of other species as well. So these keystone species are some of the ones that are the most important to make sure that we protect, because if you're not just losing one species, if you lose them, you might be losing potentially dozens of other species as well. Everything in ecology has a kind of domino effect quality to it. Once that first block falls, several others are going to start falling in succession. So it's really important to try to prevent that first block from falling, to prevent that keystone species from disappearing in the first place. The next vocabulary term that you need to know is indicator species. So here I have a couple of pictures of an insect that you can find in Pennsylvania. If you have spent any amount of time camping, you may have seen some of these out in natural settings. When I was in Scouts, they were first introduced to me as pterodactyl moths, but I have yet to actually find anyone else who calls them that. Their proper name are Dobson flies or Hellgrammites, and I'm pretty fond of the name Hellgrammite. It sounds it sounds mythological to me, so that's what I call them nowadays, is Hellgrammites. Hellgrammites are an indicator species, which means that they are extremely sensitive to pollution. So you won't just find these out in any old location. You find them near wetlands, you find them near streams, freshwater sources, and only wetlands and streams that are very, very clean. And not just clean, but clean year-round. And that's the value of indicator species. If you want to know whether or not a stream is polluted right now, you can go and do some chemical tests and you can find out if there's an excess amount of nutrients. You can figure out what the dissolved oxygen is in there. You can figure out if there's oil pollution in there or if it's got a low pH or a high pH. You can figure out what the current state of that stream is. But those chemical tests can only tell you about the present. They can only tell you about right now. These Hellgrammites live their entire life cycle at this stream. So if their population has a giant drop, if there's no Hellgrammites in this stream, and there should be, it tells you that even if it's clean right now, something happened over the course of the last year that interfered with their life cycle. There was pollution, a massive amount of pollution at some point, or enough pollution to damage their life cycle, to kill off their eggs or to kill off the adults, something along those lines. So if you come out here and you do a census every few months, every year or something like that, you can pinpoint when certain pollution events likely occurred, and then you can use that information to figure out, okay, so something's happening about this point in time. That's very valuable because streams are constantly flowing, so they will rid themselves of pollutants pretty fast, at least compared to, say, something like a lake or another standing source of water. But that doesn't mean that the pollutants don't do damage, as you can see from the Hellgrammite population plummeting suddenly. So if there's someone who's periodically dumping pollutants into the riverway, or maybe not even intentionally, just like runoff coming from a farm, then this is a good way to notice that kind of thing, something that otherwise may have slipped by us entirely. These indicator species can give us a warning to say, hey, this ecological community is getting damage. It's just the damage is occurring when we're not looking, at points in time throughout the year when we're not doing our tests, but something is affecting this population. So an indicator species is one that is sensitive to environmental conditions, and when their population drops, it tells us that at some point throughout the year, something has happened to affect those conditions. Another example are trout species. They're extremely sensitive to temperature and oxygen levels. So if there was, for example, a power plant, like a nuclear power plant that is venting its water, one of the ways that nuclear power plants work is that they heat up water to generate steam to turn turbines, and then that hot water is generally put back into streams and rivers. It has to be cooled off first. That's when you see the giant plumes of steam coming out of those reactor towers. It's the cooling off process. The water's not radioactive. It's just hot. But sometimes if the water is too hot coming back into streams and rivers, well, fish are very sensitive to temperature changes. So that can kill off fish. It can kill off trout eggs, as a matter of fact. So if you're killing off a whole bunch of trout eggs, suddenly the trout population the next year is going to plummet. So a trout can also be an indicator species that, hey, something's wrong. The way that we are delivering this water back into the ecosystem is causing problems for that ecosystem. Oxygen levels, dissolved oxygen levels, can be an indicator of a bunch of different issues. It could mean that there is waste runoff from local cattle farms coming through in terms of organic wastes from like feces and that sort of thing that's coming through rainwater and then washing off from those cattle farms and coming down here. That sort of thing can be fixed by putting in vegetation buffer zones between the cattle ranch and the water source, and the vegetation, plant matter, can absorb some of the excess nutrients and organic waste before it ever gets down to the river, and that can improve the quality of the ecosystem. So indicator species help us to make these kinds of decisions. They kind of give us a red flag to say, hey, something's up, and then we can come up with a conservation plan to fix the issue. I won't spend too much time on this next slide because I feel like I already talked about it a bit, but functional diversity talks about the jobs in an ecosystem, the niche in an ecosystem, and you want to have a lot of different organisms that can fill any given niche. So on the left, we have carnivores that all might occur all in the same ecosystem. Now, obviously, each of these carnivores has certain preferences, right? They have certain specialties. This turtle is going to be hunting more like fish and that kind of thing. This fox is going to be aiming for more like squirrels and mice, that kind of thing. This coyote more like rabbits. The bear larger game. The hawk maybe rabbits and squirrels and mice and that kind of thing. So we have a little competition with the fox. The bear and the coyote might have some crossover as well. And that's part of the important part of functional diversity, is that if you have the population of one of these predators go down, some of the other predators can fill in those roles, right? If the fox disappears, well, the population of the hawk will suddenly have more food available for it, right? So it will continue keeping the populations of the squirrels and the mice down, even if the fox population is depressed for a little while. Same with the herbivores over here. They have different focuses, but all of them have the same functional role of being herbivores, of being primary consumers in their ecosystem. Next, to expand on the idea of ecosystem diversity, this is showing how the biome can change, how the ecosystems can change. Just walking from San Francisco to, say, Baltimore. So you're just going across the 39th parallel, walking across the United States, and you can see how many different types of biomes, types of ecosystems you are going to go through on that trek. So I'm going to walk you through this because we're going to talk in a little bit more detail about which abiotic factors cause which terrestrial biomes to occur. So this is going to be kind of an introduction to that idea. You're going to start out in what's called chaparral ecosystem. It's coastal shrubland. Shrubland or scrubland, it's frequently called as well. Some trees, but not a lot of trees, mostly shrubs and ground cover plants. This is Southern California, right? Driving along the roadside in Southern California. But as you move up the mountains and the temperature decreases, you got a lot of snowfall on the ground, you are going to have trees that are specialized for long-term cold weather conditions. And that means that their leaves are going to be shaped in a way to prevent water loss and such that they can do photosynthesis a year round because it's cold all the time. So there's no point in them dropping their leaves for half the year and then growing them for half the year because it's just cold all the time. So those are coniferous forests. Pine trees and fir trees and spruce trees are very well adapted for cold conditions where there's not a lot of seasonal variation in between time points. So that's up the mountain where it's a little bit colder. Like I said, moving up in altitude is a lot like moving north in latitude. Then you get to the opposite side of the mountain and it's a desert. Now, this actually happens with some frequency. When you have an ocean, you get a lot of evaporation. So you get a lot of cloud cover, and those clouds start to move inland. But as the clouds move up towards the mountain and the air cools off, it deposits all of its rain, all the precipitation falls on the ocean side of the mountain range. And then the air continues to move over the mountain range, but it's lost all of its water. So only dry air makes it over this mountain range. So if the landscape in the valley on the opposite side is only getting dry air coming over it at all times, you get a desert created. The abiotic factors that are generating this ecosystem are as a result of the geographic factors about its position. Because it's on the opposite side of a mountain range from an ocean, you are going to get a desert. If you look at a lot of topographic maps, you'll find this pretty frequently. Deserts are usually on the opposite side of mountain ranges from oceans. Now, what is the dominant vegetation in deserts? It's going to be cactuses, right? Cacti. And these are relatively large plants that are succulent. They have lots and lots of water stored up inside of them. And that is because there's such low rainfall here that whenever there is some rainfall, the plants have to try to hoard as much water as possible. So cactuses hoard as much water as they possibly can. They suck it up as quickly as they can. There are other plants, small shrubs, that space themselves out from each other. They will actually use chemical poisons to carve out a little bit of territory for themselves and prevent other plants from being able to set up shop anywhere near them, which is why you frequently see shrubs spread so far apart from each other in desert ecosystems. So the plant life is relatively sparse because nutrients and water and resources are really hard to come by in desert ecosystems. And you can see how the variety of plants that you get depends on the abiotic factors. So these cacti, being large succulent plants, hoarding a lot of water inside of them, makes them resistant to big fluctuations in temperature change. And deserts have big fluctuations in temperature change. We often think about them as being hot all the time, but actually at night, deserts get freezing cold. So they're freezing cold at night, and they're very, very hot during the day. Being filled up with as much water as possible makes you more resistant to that kind of temperature change. Water is kind of stubborn in changing temperature. You know how a watched pot never boils? It kind of refuses to heat up. And if you've ever jumped into a swimming pool on a cold morning when it was hot the day before, you might know that the water's still warm. Water resists temperature change in that way. So this is an adaptation for that type of environment. As we continue over that valley and we get back up into the mountains, we get a coniferous forest right up at the peaks once again. And we continue our way down, and now we're getting closer to some water sources again, so we get into the Great Plains. You have sustained rainfall in fairly low amounts, not high enough rainfall to sustain trees, but we have enough that comes through at a steady enough amount to support grasses. Now, if you were to look at the average temperature and the average rainfall of deserts and grassland ecosystems, they're not that far off from each other. Grassland ecosystems are typically very warm year-round, and they have fairly low rainfall. The major difference is that grassland ecosystems don't have these major fluctuations in temperature from day to night. They don't get really, really cold at night, and they don't get really, really blisteringly hot during the day. This is partly because there's a higher moisture content in the air, which makes them more resistant to those dramatic fluctuations in temperature. And the rainfall that they get is a little bit more reliable in small amounts. And because the temperature is more stable and the rainfall is a little bit more predictable, that is really good for grasses, which is deserts are not as good for these large fields of grasses. Grasses don't deal well with these large fluctuations in temperature change or long periods where there's absolutely no water available whatsoever. They need to be able to pull up water from really shallow root systems. So if there's no water at all in the top layers of the soil, like you would find in deserts, grasses aren't going to be able to survive very well. Okay, so it's the temperature and the rainfall that determines that grasses are the ideal vegetation type for these prairie grasslands, for this ecosystem. So then what kind of animals are we going to get there? Well, mostly large herbivores, grazing animals, and large herbivores because there's plenty of food to be able to walk around and graze on. So you're going to get large hooved mammals, right? Things like bison and that kind of thing, walking around eating these large grasses, which is what you see in these ecosystems. Or if we're in Africa, something like antelope and that sort of thing, or zebras. Now, as we move further east, we get up in the mountains again, and we are getting closer to another large water source. So we're going to get more rainfall because there's more evaporation, higher amounts of rainfall, but the mountains are lower. The Appalachian Mountains have been here on Earth for a longer period of time. So weathering and erosion have actually made them shallower. They've rounded them off and they've decreased their overall size, which means that they don't have the same dramatic peaks that you get in the Sierra Nevada mountains, which is blocking the water from being able to get over them. So instead, the water is able to actually get over top and spread over this whole area. And also you don't have the dramatic altitude change that you had over on the other mountain range. So instead what you get is a deciduous forest. There's enough water to support a large population of trees, but they are influenced by the changes in seasons. So what they do is they drop their leaves during the cold season, where it's just not efficient for them to be doing photosynthesis, where they can just do all their photosynthesis during the spring and summer, where there's it's warm enough for them to put out big broad leaves and capture as much sunlight as possible, and then go dormant for half the year. So these are your oaks, your maples, your beeches, your sycamores, a lot of big flowering trees. Now that's not to say that there aren't any cone-bearing trees in the Appalachian Mountains. Obviously there are, especially if you get high up in altitude. But the dominant ecosystem around this whole area is a deciduous forest ecosystem. And there's obviously some variation depending on where you go specifically, because we have good ecosystem diversity. But for simplicity, this diagram just makes it look like the whole East Coast is a deciduous forest ecosystem.